Ms. Reyes, the formal accusation is of misappropriation of property, with a historical value estimated at $2.3 million. How do you declare it? The judge's voice echoed through the packed Westbridge County courtroom. Rosa Reyes remained standing, her shaking hands holding a worn folder. At 47 years old, after working for the Cunningham family for 17 years, she never imagined she would end up there, alone, without a lawyer, accused of stealing a jewel she had never touched. News cameras captured every second of her humiliation. The flashback of lights blinded her as reporters whispered among themselves, already decided on her guilt even before the verdict. "Innocent, Your Excellency," he replied in a firm but low voice, carrying the Filipino accent that he had never been able to completely disguise, no matter how many years he had lived in the United States. Across the room, sitting in the front row in a $3,000 gray suit, Richard Cunningham crossed his legs with calculated arrogance. His personal lawyer, the renowned Dr. Morrison Blake, organized stacks of documents printed on letterhead, displaying absolute confidence. Richard didn't even look at Rosa. For him, this was just a tedious procedure before a guaranteed victory. "Your Honor," Blake began, rising with practiced theatrics, "the defense has not even provided adequate legal representation. This clearly demonstrates the lack of resources or support from someone who knows deep down she is guilty." Muffled laughter arose among those present. Rosa felt the weight of each look of contempt. She didn't have money to hire a lawyer. His request for a public defender had been denied due to excessive demand. She was all alone against the unlimited power of the Cunninghams. The judge frowned. "Ms. Reyes, do you understand the gravity of this situation without legal representation?" "Yes, sir," Rosa replied, lifting her chin slightly. Something in his eyes, however, caught the attention of some people in the room. It wasn't despair. It was a strange, almost disturbing calm, as if she was holding something that others were unaware of. Richard finally looked at her just for a second and felt an inexplicable discomfort. That woman had cleaned his house, taken care of his son, prepared his meals for almost 2 decades. How dare he maintain that dignified posture after everything? Rosa remembered the day it all started. 3 weeks ago, Margaret Cunningham, the family's controlling matriarch, had walked into the kitchen, her face red with mock anger. "The imperial sapphire is missing from the vault. You were the only person near that room last night. Mrs. Margaret, I never—" "Silence, I called the police. Pack your things and leave my property immediately." Rosa barely had time to react before she was escorted out by security guards, under the curious eyes of neighbors. Their bags were thrown onto the sidewalk like trash. 17 years of loyalty thrown away in less than an hour. What Margaret didn't know was that Rosa had noticed strange little signs in the last few weeks. Whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Margaret locking drawers that were previously open, and mainly, Richard's increasingly distant behavior, avoiding crossing paths with her in the corridors. Something was being planned. Rosa felt it but couldn't imagine it would be something so cruel. In court, Blake continued his fiery speech. This woman had unrestricted access to the Cunningham residence. She knew the family's routine. She knew exactly where the valuables were. The opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, was in her hands every day. Rosa clenched her fists. Every word was a stab, but he remained silent, waiting for the right moment. Not the time to defend yourself with empty words, but the time to act. At the back of the room, almost imperceptible among the onlookers and journalists, sat a 21-year-old young man. Daniel Reyes, Rosa's son, a third-year law student, observed everything with surgical attention. He wasn't there officially. "I still didn't have a license to practice law, but it was there for a very specific reason, and that reason was about to change everything." Blake finished his speech with a victorious smile. "The defense has no way to refute the facts. We ask that the accused be found guilty and sentenced to the fullest extent of the law." The judge banged the gavel. "We will return tomorrow at 9 a.m. for follow-up. The accused remains on probation until further notice." Rosa left the room under the weight of accusing looks and camera flashes, but as he walked down the cold courtroom hallway, his lips curved into a discreet smile. Because Rosa Reyes wasn't just a maid, she was the mother of a brilliant son who she raised alone, working 3 jobs to pay for his education. And that son had just given him deliver something that would change the game completely. The night before, Daniel had discovered something in the Cunningham family's digital archives, something that Margaret and Richard thought was hidden forever. But technology in the right hands doesn't keep secrets. As Rosa left the building, Richard Cunningham celebrated with his lawyer at an expensive restaurant. "Tomorrow this ends. She's going to prison and we'll never hear from these people again." Margaret toasted with champagne. 17 years was too long. She was getting too comfortable. She needed to be reminded of her place. What neither of them realized was that, At that exact moment, their lives were beginning to fall apart, and it all started with a child of just 9 years old. Liam Cunningham, Richard's youngest son, was awake in his room, looking at the framed photo of Rosa that he secretly kept in his drawer. She had been more of a mother to him than Margaret had ever been, and he knew something that no one else knew. He knew the truth. If you're enjoying this story of courage and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen in that courtroom will prove that underestimating those you consider invisible can be the costliest mistake of your life. The night after the first hearing, Rosa returned to the small apartment she shared with Daniel in a working-class neighborhood of Westbridge. His feet hurt from standing in court for so many hours, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the weight of the public humiliation he was carrying. Daniel was waiting for her in the living room, surrounded by 3 open laptops and stacks of printed documents. His eyes were red with exhaustion, but they shone with a fierce determination that Rosa recognized well. It was the same expression he had at age 12, when he decided he would become a lawyer to defend people like his mother. "I got it," he said simply, turning one of the laptops so she could see. On the screen, a series of emails dated 2 months ago. Sender, Margaret Cunningham. Recipient, Richard Cunningham. Subject, solution to the RR problem. Rosa read in silence, her hands shaking slightly. "How did you get that? Remember when I fixed their office computer last month? Let's say I installed a little automatic backup program that they don't know exists." Daniel smiled humorlessly. "Technically illegal as evidence, but perfectly useful for knowing exactly what we're up against." The emails revealed a meticulously planned conspiracy. Margaret was desperate to get rid of Rosa, not because of theft, but because Liam was increasingly attached to the Filipino maid and less obedient to his controlling grandmother. One specific sentence made Rosa's blood run cold. "She's stealing my grandson. I need to eliminate her before it's too late. They planted the sapphire in your locker 3 days before they discovered it was missing," Daniel explained, pointing to another exchange of messages. Richard had doubts at first, but Margaret convinced him by saying it was for the good of the family. Rosa closed her eyes. 17 years of loyalty, reduced to nothing by jealousy and class prejudice, but the sadness quickly gave way to something stronger. Anger. Cold, calculated, absolutely focused anger. "We can't use these emails directly in court," Daniel continued, "but they give us the map of what really happened. And if we know what happened, we can find admissible evidence that tells the same story." Rosa nodded slowly. "What do we need to do?" "First, we need a real lawyer, someone who isn't afraid of the Cunninghams." Daniel hesitated. "I know we don't have money, but—" "I do," Rosa interrupted him softly. She went to her room and came back with a small metal box. Inside, stacks of carefully stored notes. "I saved for years. For your college originally, but you got the scholarship, so I saved it for emergencies." She smiled sadly. "I think that qualifies." Daniel looked at the money and then at his mother, feeling a lump in his throat. That money represented years of sacrifice, double shifts, worked holidays, and she was willing to spend it all to clear her own name. Meanwhile, across town, the Cunningham family celebrated what they considered a guaranteed victory. In the colonial-style mansion valued at $8 million, Margaret organized a dinner for close friends, all from the same privileged social class. "It was absolutely necessary," she explained to Mrs. Victoria Chen, wife of a state senator. "These people need to understand their limits." Rosa was getting very comfortable giving input on Liam's upbringing, acting like she was part of the family. Victoria shook her head in performative solidarity. "It's always the same story. You give the hand and they want the arm. You did well to act quickly." Richard watched the conversation from a distance, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Unlike his mother, he did not feel pleasure in that situation. There was something deeply wrong with destroying the life of someone who had never done them any harm. But Margaret had always had this power over him. When she said something needed to be done, he obeyed. Upstairs, Liam was awake despite the late hour. He had heard the adults talking about Rosa, saying horrible things, calling her a thief and an opportunist. But Liam knew the truth. He had seen everything. The night the sapphire disappeared, Liam had gone down to get water and saw his grandmother leaving Rosa's room with something in her hands. When asked what she was doing, Margaret had made up an excuse about looking for important documents. At the time, Liam hadn't thought much about it. But now, listening to the conversations, the pieces were starting to fall into place. He wanted to tell his father, but he was afraid. Margaret was scary when crossed. What if no one believed him? What if they said he was confusing things like adults always did when children tried to talk? Liam grabbed his tablet and, with modern children's natural ability with technology, began researching how to help someone wrongly accused. The results led him to websites about child testimony in court. He read everything carefully, memorizing every detail. Back at Rosa's apartment, Daniel had made contact with a lawyer who had agreed to hear the case. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, known for taking on difficult causes and not being intimidated by powerful opponents. She had grown up in a similar neighborhood to Rosa and understood perfectly what it meant to fight the system. "You guys have something interesting here," Sarah said during the initial meeting reviewing the documents Daniel had gathered. "But we need more. The Cunninghams have unlimited resources. Blake will bring fabricated witnesses, purchased forensics, anything necessary to secure a conviction. What if we got access to the mansion's security records?" Daniel asked. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The security cameras? Didn't they hand that over voluntarily?" "No. Blake argued that it would violate the family's privacy." Daniel smiled slightly. "But I know the system. I installed half of those cameras when I worked there as a technical assistant over the summer, and I know it's all stored on a cloud server. If you hack this, we won't be able to use it as evidence," Sarah warned. "I don't need to hack," Daniel replied. "I just need to know exactly what times to request via court order. If we know what we're looking for, we can force them to deliver." Sarah looked at the young man with newfound respect. "You haven't graduated yet, and you already think like a criminal lawyer. I like that." In the following days, as the media continued to paint Rosa as guilty, the defense team worked quietly. Daniel was able to remotely access the security system's metadata, not the videos themselves, but information about when each camera was activated or deactivated. What he discovered was devastating to the prosecution's case. On the night of the alleged robbery, the camera in the hallway near Margaret's safe had been manually deactivated for 47 minutes, exactly the period during which Margaret claimed to have been asleep. Even more interesting, the access code used to deactivate the system was Margaret's personal one. "They'll argue that Rosa could have discovered the code," Sarah mused. "They could," Daniel agreed, "except the code was changed the week before. Rosa was no longer working at the house when the change happened. There was no way for her to know." Sarah smiled for the first time since taking the case. "Now we're getting somewhere." But Blake was also preparing. He had recruited 3 former Cunningham employees, all of whom had been fired over the years, offering generous financial compensation in exchange for testimony that Rosa had always shown interest in the family's valuables. One of them, Thomas Chen, a former driver, had been paid $50,000 to say that he had once heard Rosa talking about how much the Imperial Sapphire was worth. The story was completely fabricated, but Thomas needed the money to pay off gambling debts. The second hearing was scheduled for the following week. Rosa knew it would be even more brutal than the first. Blake would bring in his false witnesses, present constructed evidence, and turn the courtroom into a spectacle of class and prejudice. But for the first time since the nightmare began, Rosa didn't feel alone. She had Daniel, she had Sarah, and she had something the Cunninghams would never have imagined they had: the truth and patience to wait for the exact moment to reveal it. While Rosa was getting ready for bed that night, his cell phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Rosa, it's me, Liam. I secretly took Dad's phone. I saw what Grandma did. I saw everything. How can I help you?" Rosa read the message 3 times, tears silently streaming down her face. The boy she had raised was willing to face his own family for her. She typed carefully, "Thank you, my love. Just be brave when the time comes. I promise everything will be okay." But Rosa didn't yet know that Liam's courage would be tested in ways neither of them could predict, and that Margaret, upon realizing the threat that her own grandson posed to her plans, was about to take desperate measures. The game was just beginning, and anyone who underestimates the determination of a Filipino mother who worked 3 jobs to raise a brilliant son was about to learn a very expensive lesson. Sarah Mitchell wasn't the kind of lawyer who took impossible cases out of kindness. She accepted them because she hated losing, especially to people like the Cunninghams. His childhood in a trailer park in suburban Detroit had taught him that people with too much money and too few scruples needed to be confronted with the only thing they truly respected: consequences. "We have 72 hours until the next hearing," she explained, spreading documents out on the table in Rosa's apartment. "Blake will bring in witnesses. I've already identified 3 former employees who received suspicious payments in recent weeks." Daniel pointed to the laptop screen. "Thomas Chen, former driver. $50,000 deposited into his account 2 days after agreeing to testify. The transfer came from a shell company registered in Delaware, but I was able to trace it back to Richard Cunningham." Rosa watched silently, processing the extent of the conspiracy against her. 17 years of honest work reduced to a calculated operation of destruction, but something inside her, forged by years of surviving alone in a foreign country, refused to break. "They will claim that the money was payment for previous services," Sarah continued. "But the temporal coincidence is strong. We need to discredit these testimonies before they are presented. I know Thomas. Rose said softly. He was fired by Margaret 3 years ago because he refused to lie about an accident she caused while driving drunk. He hated working there. Sarah smiled. Hate enough to take bribes and commit perjury? Enough hate to have documented everything before leaving, Rosa replied. Thomas showed it to me once. He kept a detailed diary of all the irregularities he saw. He said one day it would be worth money. Daniel and Sarah exchanged looks. Do you know where to find him? 2 hours later, Daniel was sitting in a seedy bar on the east side of town, waiting for Thomas Chen. The former driver arrived nervously, constantly looking at the door as if he expected to be followed. I shouldn't be here, Thomas muttered, sitting down quickly. If the Cunninghams find out that you accepted $50,000 to make up lies? Daniel interrupted, sliding a copy of the bank statement across the table. We already know. Thomas paled. Listen, kid, you don't understand the kind of pressure these people apply. I have debts, creditors who don't accept excuses, and a criminal record for perjury will help with that. Daniel leaned forward. My mother worked for that family for 17 years. She took care of their son while her own grandmother was too busy controlling fortunes. And you're going to destroy her life for money you'll probably spend in a week? Thomas looked away, the weight of guilt visible on his tired features. What do you want from me? The truth, and that diary you kept. There was a long silence before Thomas finally nodded. It's in a safe at the bank, but if I hand it over, I'm finished. The Cunninghams will sue me, maybe worse. What if we guarantee their protection? Immunity in exchange for truthful testimony against them? Thomas laughed humorlessly. You don't have the power to guarantee that. No, Daniel admitted, but the prosecution does. And when they know what's in that diary, they'll want to make a deal. While Daniel negotiated with Thomas, Rosa faced her own challenge. Liam's message continued to burn in his memory. The boy wanted to help, but involving him was dangerous. Margaret would not hesitate to silence her own grandson if she felt her control was threatened. But Liam wasn't asking permission. The next morning, Rosa received another message. I found where Grandma hides things. There's an old notebook with lots of emails. I can't open it without a password. What do I do? Rosa immediately responded, Don't do anything, it's dangerous. Please, Liam. The answer came quickly. I've already taken photos of everything I got. Sending now. Rosa's phone began vibrating with dozens of images, photos of documents, bank statements, pages from a handwritten diary, and then, the most devastating piece, a series of printed emails between Margaret and a private investigator hired to create compelling evidence against the Filipina MAID. Rosa felt her hands tremble when she saw how coldly her destruction had been planned. Every detail meticulously calculated, the sapphire planted in your closet, the purchased witnesses, even the dramatic discovery of the alleged robbery, timed to when Rosa could not present a solid alibi. She forwarded everything to Daniel, who immediately passed it on to Sarah. The lawyer called 10 minutes later, her voice full of suppressed emotion. Rosa, this is pure dynamite. Conspiracy, fabricating evidence, bribing witnesses. We're not just going to win this case. We're going to destroy the Cunninghams. But Sarah didn't know that Margaret already suspected something. That afternoon, she had summoned Richard to her office for an urgent conversation. The matriarch sat behind the imposing mahogany desk, her fingers drumming nervously over the polished surface. Liam is acting strangely, she said without preamble. Yesterday I caught him going through my drawer. When I asked him what he was looking for, he lied and said it was a sketchbook. Richard sighed. He's a child, Mom. Children are curious. Children are loyal too, Margaret replied, her eyes narrowing. Unless someone is influencing them against their own family. Rosa hasn't had contact with him since. Are you sure about this? Margaret slid Liam's phone across the table. I found this hidden under his mattress. An old cell phone that I thought I had thrown away. Richard picked up the device, his stomach sinking as he saw the message history between Rosa and his son. There was nothing incriminating in the conversations, just mutual affection and longing, but Margaret would interpret it differently. She is manipulating our son, Margaret declared, her voice icy. Using him to sabotage the case. We need to act fast. Blake needs to know this immediately. Mom, these are just messages from a child missing someone who took care of him his whole life. Someone who stole from us, Margaret corrected venomously. And if you don't have the stomach to protect this family, I will. That night, Blake was instructed to request a restraining order preventing any contact between Rosa and Liam. More than that, he should argue that Rosa was using the boy to intimidate witnesses and obstruct justice. When the news reached Rosa through Sarah, she felt genuine anger for the first time since the beginning of the nightmare, not against the theft charge, not against public humiliation, but against the attempt to transform the love between her and Liam into something dirty and criminal. They can't do that, Rosa said, her voice shaking. Liam is a child. He needs support, not to be used as a weapon. Legally, they can try, Sarah admitted, but we're going to contest it. And with what Thomas handed us today, we have plenty of ammunition. Thomas Chen's diary was a goldmine of irregularities. It documented years of Margaret's abusive behavior, employees fired without cause, wages withheld, veiled threats, financial manipulation. But the most explosive entry dated 3 months before the accusation against Rosa. MC asked me today how much it would cost to make someone professionally disappear, Thomas had written. He said that one of the employees was becoming too important in Elle's life. I refused to participate. I'm sure he'll find someone else. Sarah highlighted that passage. That establishes clear premeditation. Margaret had been planning to get rid of you for months. The sapphire was just the excuse she made up. Daniel had another revelation. I gained access to Margaret's medical records through a source I cannot reveal. He hesitated, looking at his mother. She was in intensive psychiatric treatment for the last 6 months. Control disorder, paranoia related to loss of family influence. Rosa closed her eyes. Part of her felt sorry for Margaret, a woman so consumed with fear of losing control that she would destroy anyone in her path. But compassion had limits, especially when the victim of that paranoia was you. Shall we use this? Rose asked. Only if necessary, Sarah replied. I'd rather destroy them with their own actions, not with medical conditions, but it's good to have up your sleeve. 48 hours before the decisive hearing, every piece was falling into place. Thomas had agreed to testify against the Cunninghams in exchange for immunity. The photos Liam had sent were being authenticated by forensic experts, and Daniel had discovered something that would change everything. The Imperial Sapphire itself had never been stolen. Diving in the region insurance agents, he had found an updated policy 3 weeks after the alleged theft. The jewelry was listed as temporarily in the possession of a third party for evaluation, the evaluator, a jewelry store in Manhattan that Margaret had personally visited. She made up the entire robbery, Daniel explained, showing the documents. The sapphire probably never left her possession. It was just an excuse to accuse you. Sarah smiled like a predator spotting injured prey. Insurance fraud, this is federal. The Cunninghams aren't just facing a civil lawsuit, they're looking at criminal charges. Rosa should have felt triumph, but she only felt tired. Tired of fighting, of proving her innocence, of existing in a world where people like her were disposable in the eyes of families like the Cunninghams. But then her phone buzzed with yet another message from Liam. I know I can't talk to you, but I want you to know that I love you, and I'm going to tell everyone the truth no matter what Grandma says. Rosa looked at those words through tears that she finally allowed to fall. A 9-year-old boy had more courage than most adults, and she wasn't going to disappoint him. Let's get this over with, she told Sarah and Daniel, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. I don't just want to be declared innocent. I want the entire world to know exactly what kind of people the Cunninghams really are. Sarah nodded slowly. Then you better prepare yourself, because when we're done, no stone will be left unturned of their reputation. Across town, Margaret toasted with champagne, confident of imminent victory. Richard watched uneasily through the window, a growing sense that something was terribly wrong, and Liam, lying in his bed, mentally rehearsed what he would say when it was time to speak, because he knew something that no one else knew. He hadn't just seen Margaret hide the sapphire. He had recorded everything on the iPad he had received for Christmas. The storm was brewing, and the Cunninghams, blinded by arrogance and privilege, had no idea the hurricane was about to destroy everything they had built. Sometimes revenge doesn't need to be planned. She just waits patiently for the moment when the truth becomes inevitable. The morning of the decisive hearing dawned with a gray sky over Westbridge, as if even the weather recognized that something definitive was about to happen. Rosa dressed in her best outfit, simple but dignified, and looked at herself in the mirror for the last time before leaving. 17 years of humiliation, 3 weeks of public hell, and finally, the chance to turn the tide. Daniel was waiting for her in the car, along with Sarah Mitchell. The lawyer was reviewing her notes for the 5th time, checking every detail. Thomas is confirmed. Liam too, she said without looking up from the papers. It all depends on how Blake reacts when we start presenting the evidence. He's going to try to discredit everything, Daniel observed, driving through the still empty streets. That's what lawyers like him do. They attack the credibility of witnesses when they can't attack the facts. Rosa remained silent in the back seat, her hands clasped in her lap. She wasn't nervous. It was beyond that. There was a strange calm taking over her, the same calm she had felt when she decided to immigrate to the United States alone at the age of 22, pregnant and unable to speak English. The calm of someone who has already survived the worst and knows they can survive anything. In court, the room was even more crowded than in previous hearings. Reporters occupied every available seat, cameras strategically positioned to capture every angle. The story of Filipino MAID versus millionaire family had gone viral nationally, dividing opinions and sparking heated debates about privilege and justice. Margaret Cunningham entered like a queen, her Chanel suit and discreet but expensive jewelry, shouting silent power. Richard followed a few steps behind, visibly uncomfortable with the media attention. Blake greeted them with his usual confident smile, completely oblivious to the storm about to crash over them. Judge Hartley, a 58-year-old black man with a reputation for iron impartiality, took his place. We return to the Cunningham versus Reyes case. The defense can call its first witness. Sarah stood up with calculated elegance. Defense calls Thomas Chen to the stand. The murmur that ran through the room was instantaneous. Thomas was known as a witness for the prosecution, not the defense. Blake turned sharply to Margaret, who frowned in confusion. The former driver walked to the booth with firm steps, but his face revealed the weight of the decision he had made. "Mr. Chen," Sarah began, "you worked for the Cunningham family for how many years?" 5 years, from 2017 to 2022. "And why was he fired?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Because I refused lying about a car accident involving Mrs. Margaret Cunningham. She was driving under the influence of alcohol and crashed into a pole. You wanted me to say I was behind the wheel." Margaret stood rigid in her chair. Blake immediately stood up. "Objection. Irrelevant to the current case." "Set a standard of behavior, Your Honor," Sarah countered. "The witness is demonstrating that the accused has a history of coercing employees to participate in lies." The judge nodded. "Objection denied. Continue, Dr. Mitchell." Sarah smiled slightly. "Mr. Chen, you were recently contacted by the prosecution lawyer to testify in this case, correct?" "Yes." "And was any compensation offered?" Thomas looked directly at Margaret. $50,000 to say that I heard Rosa Reyes commenting on the value of the Imperial Sapphire and expressing interest in valuable objects in the house." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Margaret remained motionless, but her hands gripped the arms of the chair tightly. Richard closed his eyes as if trying to disappear. "Did this conversation really happen?" Sarah asked. "No, never. Rosa has never shown interest in anything other than doing her job to the best of her ability." Blake was on her feet again, her face red. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly lying to harm my clients. He was fired with cause and harbors a grudge. Does the defense have proof of these allegations?" The judge asked Sarah. "We do, Your Honor." Daniel stood up and handed the officer a folder. "Bank statement showing transfer of $50,000 from a shell company registered in Delaware to Mr. Chen's account, traced to Mr. Richard Cunningham through corporate documentation." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge examined the documents, his expression becoming progressively more severe. "Dr. Blake, were you aware of this transaction?" Blake opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. My client, this may have a perfectly legitimate explanation." "You can sit down, Dr. Blake." The judge's tone brooked no argument. Sarah continued, undeterred. "Mr. Chen, during your years working for the Cunninghams, did you keep any kind of personal records?" "Yes, a detailed diary of everything I witnessed." "And does this diary still exist?" "It exists, and it is here." Thomas took a worn notebook out of his jacket. "I documented 5 years of irregularities, employees unfairly fired, wages withheld, threats. And on page 237, 3 months before Rosa was charged, I documented a conversation I overheard between Margaret and Richard." Sarah took the diary and read it out loud. "MC asked me today how much it would cost to make someone disappear professionally. He said that one of the employees was becoming too important in Elle's life. I declined to participate. I'm sure he'll find someone else." The impact was immediate. Reporters were typing frantically. Cameras focused on Margaret, who had now completely lost her composure, her face alternating between red with anger and pale with panic. "This is ridiculous," Margaret shouted, standing up. "That man is making up lies. I would never—" "Ms. Cunningham, sit down immediately or you will be removed from the room," the judge ordered coldly. Sarah didn't give herself time to recover. Defense calls Daniel Reyes to the stand. Daniel walked calmly to the front, vowing to tell the truth. Her gaze met her mother's for a moment and Rosa nodded almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Reyes, did you work at the Cunningham residence at any point?" "Yes. For 3 consecutive summers, I was hired as a technical assistant for computer systems maintenance and security." "And did you have access to the property's surveillance systems?" "I did. I personally installed most of the cameras and set up the cloud storage system." Sarah projected an image onto the large screen set up for the trial. "Can you explain what we see here?" "This is metadata from the security system at the Cunningham mansion on the night of March 15th, the date of the alleged robbery. The camera in the hallway near Margaret's safe was manually deactivated at 10:47 p.m. and reactivated at 11:34 p.m., 47 minutes of no recording. And who disabled this camera? The access code used was Mrs. Margaret Cunningham's personal one, code that had been changed a week before. Impossible for my mother to know, as she had been prevented from entering the house at that time. Blake tried to intervene, but his voice was weak. Codes can be stolen, discovered, not when they include biometrics, Daniel interrupted calmly, zooming in on another screen. The system requires a fingerprint. The fingerprint recorded at that time matches Ms. Margaret Cunningham. Margaret was now visibly shaking, her veneer of Control-CE completely shattered. Richard had buried his face in his hands, unable to face the reality crumbling around him. But there's more, Sarah continued, her voice cutting like a blade. The defense gained access to insurance records for the Imperial Sapphire in question. Mr. Reyes, can you explain what you discovered? Daniel designed new documents. 3 weeks after the alleged theft, the Sapphire's insurance policy was updated. The jewelry was listed as temporarily in the possession of a third party for appraisal. The appraiser was Bentley & Sons, a Manhattan jewelry store, and according to the jewelry store's records, he paused for effect. Ms. Margaret Cunningham personally visited the establishment to pick up the piece after appraisal. The courtroom exploded. Journalists shouted questions. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Blake was as pale as a ghost, realizing that not only would he lose the case, but he would likely face severe ethical consequences. The sapphire was never stolen, Sarah declared, her voice cutting through the chaos. It was a complete hoax. Margaret Cunningham fabricated a crime to destroy an innocent woman because she was jealous of the relationship between that woman and her grandson. That's not true, Margaret finally exploded, standing up again. That woman was taking advantage of us. Silence! The judge roared, his patience exhausted. Ms. Cunningham, one more word, and you will be charged with contempt. But Margaret had completely lost control. Years of absolute power, of never being contradicted, of shaping reality according to your will, all collapsing in a matter of minutes. She was nothing, a maid. How dare she act like she was part of the family? How dare she steal my grandson's affection? So you admit, Sarah said calmly, that your motivation was purely to eliminate Mrs. Reyes from your family's life. Margaret realized too late what she had just done. His lawyer tried to intervene, but the damage was done. His own explosive confession, captured by dozens of cameras, destroyed any chance of defense. The judge took a deep breath, clearly struggling to control his own outrage. There will be a 15-minute recess. When we return, I want both parties prepared to— Your Honor, a childish voice interrupted. Everyone turned. Liam Cunningham was standing at the back of the room, having entered silently during the chaos. He held an iPad to his chest, his eyes determined despite the tears streaming down his face. I need to talk, the boy said, his voice shaking but steady. I saw everything, and I recorded it. Richard stood up immediately. Liam, don't— But the boy was already walking towards the front, ignoring his grandmother's protests and his father's desperate expression. He looked at Rosa, who had silent tears running down her face, and then turned to the judge. Can I show you what really happened? Please. The judge looked at Sarah, who nodded. Permission granted. Liam handed the iPad to Daniel, who connected it to the projection system. And then, to Margaret's utter horror and the shock of everyone present, the screen showed a nighttime recording made by a 9-year-old child. The shaky image showed Margaret sneaking into Rosa's room at 10:50 p.m. that fateful night. She opened a drawer, put something inside wrapped in fabric, looked around nervously and left. The recording continued to show Liam following her back to the vault hallway, where she deactivated the security system. Liam's childish voice whispered on the recording, "Why is Grandma in Rosa's room? Why is she hiding something?" The video ended with Margaret noticing her grandson's presence and smiling forcefully. "Just looking for some documents, honey. Go back to bed, and don't mention this to anyone. It's our little secret." Absolute silence dominated the court when the recording ended. Margaret had completely collapsed in her chair, all pretense of dignity destroyed. Richard had his face in his hands, sobbing silently. Blake simply closed her folder, knowing there was nothing else to do. Liam walked over to Rosa, who hugged him tightly as they both cried. "I'm sorry it took me so long," the boy whispered. "I was afraid no one would believe me." "You were so brave," Rose replied, her voice cracking with emotion. "So brave." Judge Hartley removed his glasses and slowly cleaned them, clearly taking a moment to process what he had just witnessed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a cold indignation that made everyone in the room pay attention. "In 30 years of presiding over this court, I have rarely witnessed anything so calculatedly cruel. Ms. Cunningham, you did not just fabricate evidence against an innocent person. You attempted to use the judicial system as a weapon to destroy someone whose only crime, and it was loving and caring for a child." He turned to Rosa. "Ms. Reyes, on behalf of this court, I apologize for what you have been forced to endure. All charges against you are immediately dismissed. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation against Margaret Cunningham for fabricating evidence, insurance fraud, bribing witnesses, and obstruction of justice. Margaret tried to speak, but no sound came out. The empire he had built over decades crumbling around him in less than an hour. As for you, Dr. Blake, the judge continued, his gaze icy, I will be reporting your conduct to the bar. If you were aware of these irregularities and proceeded anyway, your license is in serious jeopardy. Blake nodded curtly, defeated. Outside the courtroom, as Rosa, Daniel, Sarah, and Liam walked out together, the explosion of flashbulbs and questions from reporters was deafening, but Rosa didn't listen to them. She could only think of one thing as she held Liam's hand. 17 years of loyalty had paid off, not for the money or recognition, but for that exact moment, when a 9-year-old boy proved that true love knows no social class or important surname. Margaret Cunningham had tried to teach the world that people like Rosa Reyes were disposable, but it ended up teaching a very different lesson. Underestimating the strength of those who have survived challenges you would never face is always, always a fatal mistake. And as Margaret was escorted from court on remand, her handcuffs glinting under the merciless media cameras, Rosa finally allowed herself to smile. It wasn't a revenge smile. It was the silent smile of someone who knows that justice, when it finally arrives, tastes sweeter than any retaliation could ever have. 3 months after the trial that rocked Westbridge, Rosa Reyes's life had transformed in ways she never imagined possible. The small apartment she shared with Daniel was replaced by a modest but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, purchased with part of the compensation the Cunninghams were forced to pay for moral damages, defamation, and psychological distress. But money was never Rosa's goal. She had divided most of the compensation between educational funds for immigrant children and organizations that help domestic workers know their rights. What really mattered was happening one sunny June morning when she first walked into the office of the Rosa Reyes Foundation for Labor Justice. Executive Director Sarah Mitchell read aloud from the newly installed sign on the door, smiling with genuine pride. It has a good sound, don't you think? Rosa played the recorded lyrics, still not completely used to the idea. The foundation, funded by public donations that emerged after her story went viral nationally, offered free legal assistance to domestic workers falsely accused of crimes. In just 3 months, they had already helped 47 people to prove their innocence. Daniel, now interning in Sarah's office while finishing college, was organizing stacks of new cases on the conference table. We have 12 more requests this week, all similar to what happened to you, Mom. Powerful employers using false accusations to get rid of employees they consider problematic. Then we have work to do, Rosa replied simply, sitting down and beginning to review the files. His characteristic calm remained intact, but now it carried something more: purpose, direction, the certainty that his suffering was not in vain. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the Cunninghams' lives followed a radically opposite path. Margaret was under house arrest in her mansion, now stripped of all previous glamour. Employees had resigned en masse after the trial, refusing to work for someone capable of such calculated cruelty. The high society friends, so present during the glory days, evaporated overnight. Richard visited his mother weekly, more out of obligation than affection. The family business had suffered a devastating blow following the public exposure. Contracts were canceled, investors withdrew funds, and the Cunningham name, once synonymous with prestige, had become a toxic stain on the corporate world. You destroyed everything, Richard said during one of these obligatory visits, his voice devoid of emotion. 30 years of building this empire, and you threw it away out of jealousy over a maid. Margaret, visibly aged over the past few months, did not respond. She spent her days alone in that huge house, surrounded by memories of a power that no longer existed. The criminal charges resulted in million-dollar fines, mandatory community service, and a ban on permanent option to hire domestic employees. His cruelest sentence, however, was absolute isolation. Blake, the once powerful lawyer, had lost his license following an investigation by the bar. He was found to have knowingly participated in fabricating evidence in at least 6 other cases, all involving wealthy clients against vulnerable workers. His career had ended in public disgrace, a warning to others who might consider putting money above ethics. Thomas Chen had used his immunity to start a new life away from Westbridge. Before leaving, he had visited Rosa in person to thank her for giving him the chance to do the right thing. $50,000 wouldn't be worth the conscience, he had said, shaking her hand gratefully. Thanks for reminding me of that. But the real heart of the transformation was in the relationship between Rosa and Liam. Richard, in one of the few decent gestures he had made in years, had granted informal joint custody, allowing the boy to spend weekends with Rosa. Margaret had protested violently, but her legal objections were summarily dismissed by judges who had not forgotten what she had tried to do. On a sunny Saturday, Rosa and Liam were preparing pancakes together in the kitchen of their new house. The boy, now 10 years old, chattered excitedly about school, his friends, and how he planned to be a lawyer when he grew up, just like Daniel. "You don't need to be a lawyer just because I was wronged," Rosa said softly, flipping a pancake with natural skill. "That's not why," Liam replied, serious beyond his years. "It's because you taught me that standing up for what's right matters more than anything else, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Rosa felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were tears of pure pride. That boy, raised in privilege and wealth, had consciously chosen the path of justice over the easy path of complicit silence. If she had achieved nothing else, that would be enough. Richard showed up to pick Liam up later in the afternoon. The relationship between him and Rosa remained delicate, marked by guilt on one side and cautious forgiveness on the other, but there was a budding mutual respect, built on the foundation of shared love for Liam. "He's thriving with you," Richard admitted reluctantly, watching his son put away his belongings, in ways it never thrived in that cold mansion. "Because here he is, loved without conditions," Rosa replied. "Not because of his last name or his potential to perpetuate a family legacy, just because of who he is." Richard nodded silently, the truth of those words cutting deep. He hugged his son and left, leaving Rosa at the door of her modest house, watching the expensive car disappear around the corner. She felt no triumph in seeing the man who had almost destroyed her life leave in defeat. "I only felt a quiet peace, the certainty that justice does not necessarily mean revenge." The following week, Rosa was invited to speak at a national conference on labor rights. She took the stage in front of hundreds of people, many of them domestic workers like her, with similar stories of abuse and injustice. When the spotlights came on and the cameras started rolling, Rosa took a deep breath. "My name is Rosa Reyes," she began, her clear voice echoing through the auditorium. "4 months ago, I was alone in a courtroom, without a lawyer, without money, without hope, falsely accused by people who believed my life was worthless, simply because I cleaned their houses." Applause filled the room. Rosa waited for silence to return. "But I'm not here to talk about my suffering. I'm here to tell you that you are not invisible. Your work matters. Your dignity matters. And when someone tries to take that away from you, remember, the truth always wins. It may take time, it may hurt, but it always, always wins." As she spoke, cameras captured every word for national broadcast. Margaret watched from house arrest, forced to confront the living monument of her own failure. The woman he had tried to destroy now inspired millions, her story of resilience echoing far beyond Westbridge. Daniel watched from the front row, recording every second on his cell phone. Sarah was at his side, already planning how to use that speech to recruit more volunteer lawyers for the foundation. Thomas watched from his new home in Arizona, finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. And Liam, sitting with his father at home, watched Rosa on television with eyes shining with admiration. "It's her, Dad, my second mother, the bravest person I know." Richard looked at his son and then at the screen, where Rosa continued speaking with the quiet authority of someone who had survived hell and emerged stronger. For the first time, he truly understood what he had lost when he chose silence instead of justice. Not just an excellent maid, but an extraordinary human presence that had made his house a home. Months turned into a year. The Rosa Reyes Foundation has expanded to 3 states, helping hundreds of workers prove their innocence and sue abusive employers. Daniel graduated with honors and was immediately hired by Sarah, becoming the youngest lawyer on the team. Margaret served her sentence and disappeared from public life completely. Rumors said that she had sold the mansion and moved to the country, living alone in a small house, a ghost of who she once was. No one in the family was in regular contact except Richard, who visited occasionally more out of pity than love. Blake never regained his license. He worked as a freelance legal consultant for small businesses, earning a fraction of what he used to make, shunned by everyone who knew his story. But Rosa flourished. In her second year running the foundation, she was recognized with the National Social Justice Award, receiving the honor in Washington, D.C. Liam accompanied her to the ceremony, wearing his first suit, as proud as any biological son could be. "I have a question," the presenter said during the post-awards interview. "Do you forgive the Cunninghams for what they did?" Rosa considered it carefully before responding. "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or saying what they did was acceptable. It means choosing not to let hate poison my life. They've already taken months of my peace. I won't give them another day." That response, captured on video, went viral with millions of views. People across the country commented on Rosa's class and dignity, contrasting her with Margaret's petty cruelty. The narrative was complete. The humble Filipino immigrant had won not through revenge, but through living well. The night after the ceremony, Rosa sat in the small garden of her house watching the stars. Daniel came out with 2 cups of tea, sitting next to his mother in comfortable silence. Was it worth it? He asked finally. All the suffering, the humiliation, the fear? Rosa thought for a long moment. If you asked me during the trial, I would have said no. But now I see how many lives we touched, how many people we helped, how much change we created. She looked at her son. So yes, it was worth every tear. Daniel hugged his mother, and there, under the stars, they silently celebrated, not just victory over the Cunninghams, but victory over a system that tried to convince them that people like them didn't matter. Because in the end, Rosa Reyes proved something that Margaret Cunningham would never understand. Dignity cannot be bought with money or destroyed with false accusations. It lives in the hearts of those who refuse to be broken, of those who turn pain into purpose, and of those who choose to lift others up rather than trample them. Margaret Cunningham tried to erase Rosa Reyes from history, but he ended up doing the opposite. It transformed an invisible maid into a national symbol of resistance, justice, and the unshakable truth that underestimating the strength of those who have survived battles you would never face is always, inevitably, the costliest mistake anyone can make. And while Margaret languished in her self-imposed solitude, Rosa built a legacy that would last for generations. Not through mansions or fortunes, but through transformed lives, restored hopes, and living proof that the best revenge is not destroying those who wronged you. It's building something so big, so beautiful, so significant, that they spend the rest of their lives wondering how they so underestimated someone who was always extraordinary. Rosa learned that justice doesn't need to scream to be heard. She just has to stay standing when everyone expects you to fall. And when he finally wins, as he inevitably will, the victory will be so absolute that not even silence can hide it. That if this story of courage, dignity, and justice touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because in the real world, stories like Rosa's happen every day, and every time we share these narratives, we remind those in power that no one, absolutely no one, is too invisible to matter or too strong to be held accountable. The truth always wins, always.